Willkommen in einem anderen aufregendes video. Welcome to another exciting video. In this case, this is a part 1 of my military history series of videos. In this case, covering the first major tank engagement of World War II in Belgium. The Battle of Hannut was a Second World War battle fought during the Battle of Belgium, which took place between the 12th and 14th of May 1940 at Hannut in Belgium. It was the largest tank battle in the campaign. It was also the largest clash of tanks in armoured warfare history up to that point in time. This video is version 2. I found the first version, which I actually copied from books, made it rather difficult to actually understand what was occurring during the campaign. So I've attempted to redo it in a manner that makes it a bit easier to understand the movement of the different formations. I've also removed most of the names of commanders and replaced them with the actual formation names, as that makes it a little bit easier to try and understand what was happening. In the theatre of operations where the Battle of Hannut occurred, the primary purpose of the Germans was to tie down the strongest elements of the French First Army and keep it away from the main German attack through the Ardennes, as laid down in the German operational plan Case Yellow by Manstein. The German breakout of the Ardennes was scheduled for the 15th of May, 5 days after the German attacks on the Netherlands and Belgium. The delay was to entice the Allies into believing the main thrust would, like the Schlachten plan in World War I, come through Belgium and then drive down into France. When the Allies' armies advanced into Belgium, they would be tied down by German offensive operations in eastern Belgium at Hannut and Gembloux. With the flank of the First Army exposed, the Germans could then thrust to the English Channel, which would encircle and destroy the Allied forces. For the French, the plan in Belgium was to prepare for a prolonged defence at Gembloux, about 34 kilometres west of Hannut. The French sent 2 armoured divisions forward to conduct a delaying action against the German advance and give the rest of the French First Army time to dig in at Gembloux. The Germans reached the Hannut area just 2 days after the start of the invasion of Belgium, but the French defeated several German attacks and fell back on Gembloux as planned. The Germans succeeded in tying down substantial Allied forces, which might have participated in the Battle of Sedan, the attack through the Ardennes. The Germans failed to neutralise the French First Army completely at Hannut, despite inflicting significant casualties, but did basically achieve their stated objectives. While the French successfully managed to defend against the Germans at Hannut, they fell back to Gembloux, where they achieved additional successes on the 14th to the 15th of May. Now, in the aftermath of this success, although seriously damaged, the First Army was able to retreat to Lille, where it delayed the Germans in the siege of Lille and was instrumental in the re-embarkation of the British Expeditionary Forces, French and Belgian troops, at the evacuation of Dunkirk. The Allies committed their First Army Group, its strongest army, the French First Army, with the fully mechanised cavalry corps, to advance into Belgium to support the large but more lightly equipped Belgian army. The French expected the German attack to break the Belgian defences at the Albert Canal rather rapidly and sought to quickly establish an entrenched front line centred on Gembloux to check the main enemy effort of the campaign, which was an attempt to break through the Gembloux gap between the rivers Dyle and Meuse. As Belgium and Netherlands and Luxembourg would remain neutral until the German invasion of these countries, it had proven impossible to adequately prepare positions for the French First Army. Therefore, the Cavalry Corps was given the mission to execute a delaying battle somewhere between Gembloux and Maastricht to prevent the enemy from reaching the Gembloux area until the 8th day of an invasion and to allow the First Army sufficient time to dig in. The Cavalry Corps had been created on the 26th of December 1939, and it contained both then existing armoured divisions of the cavalry, the 1st Mech Light Division and the 2nd Mechanised Light Division. On the 26th of March 1940, however, the 1st DLM was given the mission, in case of invasion, to establish a connection with the Dutch army near Breda. This experienced active division was therefore removed from the Cavalry Corps. It was replaced by the 3rd DLM, recently constituted on the 1st of February, manned with reservists and still insufficiently trained. Nonetheless, the French commander still considered his forces sufficient to either contest a river crossing at Maastricht or wage a manoeuvre battle, or, as a third alternative, defend an improvised line. He was at liberty to choose any option, providing the enemy was kept from Gembloux long enough. He decided to keep all possibilities open and act as the situation would demand. The German plan for this sector called for an assault by airborne and shot troops to open a way through the Dutch and Belgian defences for the 4th Panzer Division and bring the Albert Canal defensive line to a premature collapse. Once the breach was made, the 16th Army Corps and Army Group B would assume control of the 4th Panzer Division, the 3rd Panzer Division and the 20th Infantry Division for their assault towards Gembloux. The specific German 16th Corps mission was to quickly launch from this bridgehead that was made by the earlier assault by airborne troops, seize the area around Gembloux before the French infantry divisions could entrench themselves, and thus confirm to the worst fears of the French High Command, draw all modern Allied forces and their reserves to the north, away from the main thrust through Ardennes. This would enable the German army to cut the French First Army, the BEF and the Belgians off by a swift advance to the English Channel, leading to a giant encirclement. As a result of these two plans, the Battle of Hannut, which is what was going to occur, became the largest tank battle of the campaign. The French DLM divisions had 2 light mechanised brigades each. Each DLM division thus had an organic strength of 260 tanks and 44 panhard armoured cars. The entire French Cavalry Corps had a total of 520 tanks, of which 176 were the S-35s, 172 were the H-35s, and 66 were the AMR-35s, 66 H-35s, and finally 88 armoured cars, the P-178. The 2nd DLM consisted of the 3rd and 4th Brigade, called respectively the 3rd BLM and 4th BLM, or Light Mechanised Brigades. The 3rd BLM was the Combat Brigade, consisting of the 13th Dragoon Tank Regiments and 29th Dragoon Tank Regiments. These were equipped with the H-35 light tanks and the excellent S-35 medium tanks. The 4th BLM was the Reconnaissance and Infantry Brigade, consisting of the 8th Cuirassiers Reconnaissance Regiment and the 1st Dragoon Mechanised Infantry Regiment. It was equipped with 44 Panhard 178 armoured cars organised in 2 squadrons and a mechanised infantry regiment equipped with 126 Lafley S-20TL personnel carriers. In addition, 3 organic AMR-35s, later called H-39, squadrons of 22 tanks were also included, as were 3 armoured command vehicles. The French mechanised infantry regiments had 3 mechanised infantry battalions each. The 3rd DLM division consisted of the 5th and 6th Brigade. The 3rd DLM used the H-39 light tank, a swifter, improved version of the H-35, and also had a single AMR squadron of 22 vehicles of the slower original batch of 400 that was exclusively present in the 2nd DLM division. Most Hotchkiss tanks of both versions were fitted with a short 37mm L21 gun, which proved a poor anti-tank weapon. Some platoon and squadron commander vehicles had been fitted with the more powerful 37 L35 gun, totalling about a fifth of the total number of Hotchkiss tanks. The 5th BLM consisted of the 1st Cuirassier Tank Regiment and the 2nd Cuirassier Tank Regiment, each regiment having 2 medium tank squadrons equipped with the excellent S-35 medium tank and 2 light tank squadrons fielding the H-39. Each squadron's organic strength was 44 S-35 medium tanks and 43 H-39 light tanks, and also 8 armoured command vehicles were present. The 6th BLM consisted of the 12th Cuirassier Reconnaissance Regiment and the 11th Dragoon Mechanised Infantry Regiment. The reconnaissance regiment was equipped with the Panhard 178 armoured cars and H-35 light tanks. The French mechanised infantry regiments had 3 mechanised infantry battalions. Using the source material that I had on hand, this is my best guess of the organisation of the French light mechanised divisions. These were excellent attacking formations, but do not look very effective in defence, especially a static defence, as it lacked sufficient infantry and artillery in order to perform that kind of mission. Like their French counterparts, the German armoured divisions each had an armoured brigade with 2 tank regiments. The latter was divided into 2 tank battalions. Each tank battalion had, apart from staff company, 2 light companies of 19 battle tanks each. The 16th Corps thus had a total of 618 tanks, of which 252 were Panzer Is, 234 were Panzer IIs, 82 were Panzer IIIs, and 50 were Panzer IVs, and 7 motorised infantry battalions. Looking at the divisions individually, the 3rd Panzer Division had 314 battle tanks in its 3rd Panzer Brigade, consisting of the 5th and 6th Panzer Regiments, which had a total of 117 Panzer Is, 129 Panzer IIs, 42 Panzer IIIs, and 26 Panzer IV. Besides these battle tanks, the 3rd Panzer Division had 27 tracked command vehicles, which were only armed with machine guns. Looking at the 4th Panzer Division, this consisted of 304 battle tanks in its 5th Panzer Brigade, which consisted of the 35th and 36th Panzer Regiments. This consisted of, in turn, 135 Panzer I, 105 Panzer II, 40 Panzer III, and 24 Panzer IV tanks. Each division also had about 56 armoured cars. Most Panzer IIs of the 16th Army Corps had not been yet up-armoured to the new 30mm standard and thus were vulnerable to even the French 37 L21 gun. As with the French, after looking at all the source material, this is my estimate of the battalion level structure of the German forces in this battle. While tank heavy, there was a generous amount of infantry formations, which proved critical in cracking the French defences. What also assisted was the addition of an infantry division which came up near the end of the battle, which proved instrumental in basically occupying one of the French mechanised divisions. Drilling down into the formations, a couple of summary points. The French units were only lightly equipped with anti-tank guns, 12 25mm and 8 47mm guns per division. The situation with anti-aircraft guns was even worse, with each division only having 6 25mm anti-aircraft guns, and to the best of my knowledge, no corps-level anti-aircraft assets were involved in this particular battle. Even with artillery, which was certainly a strength for the French, there was an imbalance. The French mechanised light divisions each had about 36 pieces against the German 68 pieces. This, I must admit, in terms of the Germans, did include 24 7.5cm infantry guns per tank division. So if we remove the infantry guns, then the artillery situation was approximately even, although the French mainly possessed 75s versus the German 105s, so there was a bit of an imbalance there. The French Air Force was actually present, but only on the first day. After the first day, the French possessed minimal air assets during the battle, deploying about 80 bombers and a similar number of fighters on the first day only. The Germans used 85 fighters on the first day alone, and at various times up to several hundred dive bombers. So German air support was significantly superior to the French, but primarily in the second and third day rather than the first day. At 11 a.m. on the 11th of May, the French diverted most of the French 23rd Fighter Group to cover the advance of the First Army in its neighbouring units. After more fighters had been removed for bomber escort missions, few fighters were actually left to cover the Cavalry Corps. The Allied bombers concentrated on retarding the dangerous advance of the 16th Panzer Corps, but without fighter escorts suffered fairly heavy losses. The French had sent out forward reconnaissance forces which, once they met the German forces, fell back before the Panzers towards the main body of the French Cavalry Corps, which had established a defensive line along a 40-kilometre front with the 2nd and 3rd DLM divisions. Looking at the battlefield in more detail, the battleground which the French commander chose consisted of a plateau with occasional woods, a dense road network, extended localities or built-up areas, and a few isolated large farms. On either flank there were small streams flowing within a 2 to 3 metre deep rock cuts, but these had many crossing points, often fordable by tracked vehicles, and offering good cover for would-be infiltrators, so only had a comparatively minimal defensive capability unless defended up front. Looking at the key feature of the battlefield, there was a ridge running from Hannut up to Merdop, and this was a flat area which was ideal for panzer forces to travel along. North of this flat area or ridge there was a stream, and there was one also to the south, and as we've discussed they did offer some defensive capability but not really a great deal. Nonetheless, the ridge formed a natural corridor for mechanised forces, and this is where the initial battles occurred. The French commander placed the 3rd DLM on a 17-kilometre front, and only 11 kilometres were partially covered by anti-tank obstacles, which was an extremely long front line for this division. The French Cavalry Manual of 1939 had considered the case of a DLM division assigned to mask a breach in the front until reinforcements could arrive. In such a case, the manual ruled command would be decentralised. The division should place a combined arms force on each flank of possible penetration. Then the commander would move his artillery and his reserves to maintain a continuous line of fire. But if the enemy attacked in force along the whole front, this defence transformed itself into a manoeuvre of retreat. The manual added that the DLM division could retreat on a front of no more than 10 to 15 kilometres in average terrain. In the event of the front's extension, the absence of anti-tank obstacles and a formidable enemy, a withdrawal should be made. French doctrine warned that on a wide front, on open terrain against mass armour, the DLM division was to abandon the decentralised defence and to concentrate its forces for action. The French commander did not follow these directions in this particular battle. What ended up being an even more major issue was that the dividing line between the two divisions, that is French divisions, actually sat on the ridge, which was the natural advance of the German forces, which would require very close cooperation between the two divisions. This kind of did not occur. Looking at the 1st Division, the 3rd DLM, the front was divided into a northern and southern sector. The northern sector had from north to south the 12th Cuirassiers in touch with British and Belgian cavalry further north, as you can see here. As we moved down, there was a line of 2 battalions of the 11th Dragoon Regiment, the 3rd Battalion with 21 Hotchkiss tanks, plus another such squadron from the 1st Cuirassier Battalion, and supported by 21 75mm guns from the Cavalry Corps Reserve, and the 2nd Battalion holding 5 kilometres, similarly with its own Hotchkiss light tanks, plus another squadron from the 1st Cuirassiers, and supported by 12 75mm guns from the 76th Artillery Regiment. Behind the northern part of the defensive line manned by the 3rd DLM stood one squadron of the excellent medium S-32 tanks of the 1st Cuirassiers. In the southern part of the defensive line manned by the 3rd DLM, the French deployed 1 battalion and 2 tank squadrons along the 5 kilometres southern sector of the division astride the dangerously open terrain facing Hannut. This force consisted of the 1st Battalion of the 11th Dragoons with their light tank squadrons, plus an additional light tank squadron from the 2nd Cuirassiers, supported by 21 75mm artillery guns and 12 105mm howitzers from the 76th Artillery Regiment. The Southern Sector Reserve consisted of 1 medium tank squadron of the 1st Cuirassiers and 2 additional medium tank squadrons from the 2nd Cuirassiers. The one point that becomes quite obvious from the deployment of the 3rd DLM is that the French really did scatter their tanks everywhere, breaking up their regiments and dividing them, into little penny packets all over the place, which may have been a contributing factor in terms of not having enough tank strength to actually punch through any of the German advances. Anyway, the southern part of the front was held by the 2nd DLM Division, as you can see here, and this flowed further south from this position. However, apart from some minimal activity by a couple of the formations, this division did not really become majorly engaged in the key German thrust from Hannut towards Gembloux. It was mainly engaged with an infantry division that had come up south of the German position at a later time. On the 12th of May, the 4th Panzer Division raced to seize their first objective, Hannut, reaching the area that morning. The 3rd and 4th Panzer Divisions were ordered to concentrate on and secure Hannut to secure the 6th Army's flank. The 4th Panzer Division experienced a lack of fuel, and the artillery and infantry support had not yet caught up. As a result, the commander requested an airdrop of fuel and initially considered delaying his attack. However, he quickly concluded that he was only facing one French battalion, so as a result he decided to engage the French defences with his panzer regiments. During the advance, the 4th Panzer Division made contact with a French armoured force of about 25 tanks. The 4th Panzer Division destroyed 7 of the French tanks for no losses. Allied air units also concentrated on the 4th Panzer Division. The RAF sent over 38 bombers, losing 22. The French made 2 large bombing attacks, one including 18 of his B693 bombers on their maiden mission, losing 8. The 85 Messerschmitt 109s of Fighter Wing 27 flew 340 sorties that day, claiming 26 Allied aircraft with a loss of 4 fighters. German anti-aircraft artillery claimed another 25. But that afternoon, the Allied commander suddenly ordered air priority away from the Belgian plain to the threatened centre of the front, further south in the Sedan area. The cavalry corps formations now had little air cover for the rest of the battle. After this initial engagement with French tanks, the 35th Panzer Regiment, advancing towards Hannut, ran into fierce resistance. The French army was deployed undercover and during the battle counterattacked several times. The French forces then yielded Hannut without a fight. German forces attempted to outflank the town, unaware of the French retreat. Some 50 light panzers ran into a French strongpoint. French defences, equipped with 21 light tanks of the 2nd Cuirassiers, supported by part of the 76th Artillery Regiment, plus 5 from the nearby 2nd DLM formations. Firing from prepared positions, German medium tanks attempted to pin down the French while the light tanks moved around the French position. The main French force then retreated to Merdop. The encircled 2nd Cuirassiers were freed by an armoured counterattack from the 2nd DLM Division. The S-25 medium tanks breached the German lines and the French units broke out, suffering heavy losses in the process. The right flank of the 4th Panzer Division was now dangerously exposed. In the north, the 3rd Panzer Division moved up to cover this threat. At 4:30 p.m, German 6th Army requested air reconnaissance. The German Air Force reported French armour and motorised units at Gembloux. The commander of the German 6th Army ordered the 16th Corps forward to Gembloux to prevent the French from organising a defence. But the commander of the 16th Corps continued to worry about the stretched supply line and especially his exposed flanks. The German solution was to build an advance guard of 1 Panzer battalion and 1 rifle battalion supported by 2 artillery groups to push forward. The force advanced under heavy air and artillery cover against the French strongpoints and simply ignored the French counterattack in its rear. The French strongpoint was well barricaded and heavy French artillery and other fire met the attack, stopping the tank company on point. The remainder of the German forces flanked the French position to their right, although poor visibility hampered the movement. The Guard finally reached the western edge of the town, only to be met by strong artillery from neighbourhood French strongpoints, which continued to increase. The force was ordered to regroup its tanks and riflemen and to secure a perimeter, but before this could be done, French medium S-35 tanks counterattacked, knocking out the Panzer Regiment command tank. After hard fighting, both French and German tanks pulled back in the darkness, stumbling into each other on occasion. The French retreated to Merdop and the French to the Hannut area. At this point, the Germans were certain two French mechanised divisions were before them, which required the two German panzer divisions to coordinate their attacks. The Germans planned to mount a major offensive the next day. According to the plan, the 4th Panzer Division would operate jointly with the 3rd Panzer Division, which would receive air support. The German 3rd Panzer Division attacked that night, testing the French defences. The French strong point, shown here, fought all night against German riflemen, finally withdrawing in the early hours of the 13th of May. The front of the 3rd DLM remained. The 2nd DLM also held its original front. The only breach of the line occurred where the 2nd and 3rd DLM met. On the very first day, French armour definitely emerged victorious. To the southeast of the plain, German forces began their assault over the Meuse River, the Germans' principal effort. To the north, the Germans launched spoiling attacks and tied down the powerful French First Army, so it could not intervene. The Germans believed the newly arrived 3rd Panzer Division only had weak enemy forces before it, while the 4th Panzer Division had much stronger French mechanised forces facing it, which was generally accurate. The German Air Force struck in the late morning to soften the enemy defences. The 3rd Panzer began to advance. The 4th Panzer was to move in parallel against an expected strong Belgian anti-tank line and very quickly met French forces in a ferocious firefight. Up north, the French 12th Cuirassiers, and to the south, the 3rd Battalion of the 11th Dragoon fought off waves of German infantry supported by armoured vehicles. The German 18th Infantry Division had arrived in the position and was beginning to penetrate their position. The French command planned to counterattack with tanks from the 1st Cuirassiers in order to restore their lines, but dropped those plans due to developments on the rest of the 3rd DLM Division's front line. In the afternoon, the French command ordered retreat. The Allied forces escaped as the German infantry was too slow in following up their success. Down south, the 2nd DLM was positioned just south of the planned axis of the 4th Panzer Division's attack. In the early morning, the 2nd DLM sent some 30 S-35 medium tanks north to relieve the pressure on the 3rd DLM. However, these attacks were repulsed by heavy tank and anti-tank fire, and crippling losses were sustained. The commander of the 2nd DLM then signalled enemy infiltrations and attack by armoured cars over the river at a position just north of a Belgian stronghold south of the 2nd DLM division. These attacks were threatening to cut off the large Belgian garrison and break through the front line. The 2nd DLM, as a result, diverted its tank reserves to try and relieve this situation. After this diversion, French reconnaissance aircraft reported large concentrations of German armour in the north. However, the 2nd DLM no longer had any reserves available to intervene, ensuring the 4th Panzer Division's left flank was safe from counterattacks by this division. The issue was that the 2nd DLM Dragoons and motorised infantry were strung out in a series of isolated strong points, and thus were vulnerable to infiltration without this reserve of armour available to plug any holes. The 2nd DLM refused the offer of the Belgian 3rd Corps, retreating through his front from the Liege area to reinforce his troops, which was also another error because the Belgian forces would have been able to plug some of these gaps. The cavalry corps commander's lack of attention to French defensive doctrine and concentration allowed decentralised command to continue, which damaged the French operational performance, which created severe problems for the French defence. Basically, the French divisions were not coordinating their operations or efforts, and even within division there was a lack of coordination. German command was unaware of the French problems and was still worried of the potential of the 2nd DLM to interfere with its main attack. As a result, it force-marched infantry units between its 16th and 27th Corps and scraped together 4 units from the 35th, 61st and 269th Infantry Division, advancing via Liege, along with air support and some armoured cars, to cover the 4th Panzer Division's southern flank. These forces infiltrated between the French strong points north of the Belgian position and drew out the 2nd DLM armour, as indicated earlier. This critical German success, tying down French armour with infantry, freed the 16th Corps to concentrate it against the DLM west of Hannut. Had the 2nd DLM concentrated its armour for an advance to the north or northeast, it may have caused untold problem for the German plan. Moving up further north, the real focus of the battle on the 13th of May lay west of Hannut. An order arrived from the 6th Army to the 16th Corps, not only to break through to Gembloux, but to pursue the enemy west of that position. 16th Corps concentrated all of its Corps Panzer and rifle battalions, including about 560 operational tanks, and also aided on their right by the 18th Infantry Division of the 4th Corps on a front of some 12 kilometres, the 3rd Panzer Division on the north and the 4th Panzer Division in the south. The 3rd Panzer Brigade of the 3rd Panzer Division moved out at about 11:30 with its 5th Panzer Regiment on the right and the 6th on the left. The brigade commander moved forward with the 5th Regiment. By noon, the tanks were in action in the barricaded and mined towns along the French line along the stream. After 90 minutes of heavy fighting, both Panzer regiments succeeded in pushing elements of the French defenders over the stream. The German command then ordered most of the 6th Regiment to turn south where the terrain was more favourable and where they could aid the 4th Panzer Division. Operating on the east and west banks of the stream, which had just been crossed, the 6th Regiment ran into French armour and was then attacked by further French armour. The German battalions combined to defeat the attack, but it certainly halted their attempt to move south in their attempts to assist the 4th Panzer Division. The force which had stopped the 6th Panzer Regiment was the 1st Cuirassiers, which had been ordered north to try and force the Germans back over the stream. From 1500 to 154800 hours, the 3rd Panzer Brigade issued repeated and urgent calls for anti-tank units and air support to deal with the French tanks. The 2nd Battalion, 5th Panzer Regiment in the north suddenly found itself attacked in the flank and rear by superior armoured forces which had bypassed the 6th Panzer Regiment. The 3rd Panzer Brigade War Diary recorded the 15 minutes during the 2nd Battalion when the 2nd Battalion stood alone. The 1st Battalion, 5th Panzer Regiment, seeing victory on the left, sent its 1st Battalion back to its right, bringing the fight to a successful conclusion at about 1600 hours. Fundamentally, this had delayed the Germans. On the French side, that morning the strong points of the 2nd Battalion 11th Dragoons suffered serious losses to air and artillery bombardments, while indicating German motorcyclists followed by armoured cars were searching for infiltration and crossing points. From about 11:30, the 3rd DLM signalled some 180 panzers attacking in two spots. The Dragoons defended their strong points supported by their organic light tank squadrons, but their resistance began to crumble at around about 1300 hours as German numbers and lack of munitions told. Due to this pressure, the commander of the northern sector of the 3rd DLM front ordered a retreat. As the remaining Dragoons began their withdrawal, their Hotchkiss H-35 light tanks, together with two Hotchkiss light tank squadrons from the 1st Cuirassiers, counterattacked. The French pushed the German armour back to the streams. Losses were about even, the French claiming 6 panzers for the loss of 4. The 1st Cuirassiers dispatched 36 medium S-35 tanks to also attack and halt the German armour advancing from Orp to the west. German armoured forces then surprised the French as they attacked. An equal number of panzers attacked from cover, defeating the French counterattack. This offensive was the principal effort of the 3rd DLM to check the 3rd Panzer Division. The 2nd DLM down south launched raids against the still vulnerable flanks of the 4th Panzer Division, and some small groups of French tanks broke through, but were quickly dealt with by the German 654th Anti-Tank Battalion attached to the 4th Panzer Division. Apart from these isolated and sporadic raids, the 2nd DLM did not make any further attempts to attack the 4th Panzer Division flank. They lacked reserves, as the reserves had been sent in to attempt to counter infiltration by the German infantry divisions. The French withdrew to their next defensive position, centred around the town of Merdorp. In the afternoon, the 4th Panzer Division began the assault on this new defensive position. As the French artillery opened fire and German artillery responded, the French pushed armour into the abandoned town and skillfully changed positions, making the panzers struggle to strike their targets. The German tanks, after this setback, decided to bypass the town around its left flank, but this exposed the German infantry, who were forced to give ground against the encroaching French armour. The panzers quickly did a U-turn and engaged the French in the open. Initially, the French held the advantage due to their superior armour and firepower. But the Germans concentrated their armour on the vital point and began to push the French back. Small groups of French infantry infiltrated and attacked from the rear, but the German infantry crushed any resistance. Meanwhile, the 2nd German Panzer Regiment was attacking the other French defensive position. The Panzers prevailed through numbers and reported 22 French S-35 medium tanks totally destroyed. The German forces secured the area and the town. German forces reported taking 400 prisoners and capturing 4 to 5 tanks. After the German successes in the north, the French began a general retreat westward. The Panzer divisions, no longer fearing attack on their flanks, advanced and engaged the remnants of the enemy in the evening. The 3rd Panzer Brigade reported a tally for the day of 54 French tanks knocked out, 36 by the 5th Panzer Regiment and 18 by the 3rd Panzer Regiment. Its own losses were listed as slight. The 6th Panzer Regiment reported a provisional loss total of only 2 tanks. Now, the Germans suffered many more tanks disabled. But as the battlefield was secured, a great many were repaired. This is actually a common point. In terms of actual losses during the battles, they were approximately even. But the thing was that the Germans held control of the battlefield and they could repair their tanks while the French could not. The remnants of the 3rd DLM retreated and formed up a line behind the Belgian anti-tank obstacles. The next morning, the 2nd DLM fell back into a line south of Pervez. On the 14th of May, the 3rd Panzer Division was to engage the Allied line near Gembloux, while the 4th Panzer Division was to break through its centre at Pervez. The commander of the 16th Corps ordered the attack to commence without infantry support, but was unable to break through the French position. In the south, the 4th Panzer Division engaged the French armour, which resisted heavily in wooded areas around Pervez. After hard fighting, the French defences were destroyed with the help of German infantry, which came up later in the day. The French First Army had redistributed and spread its tank battalions behind the infantry. Spread out and unsupported, they were defeated by the concentration of numerically superior German combined arms teams. This was a common occurrence during this campaign. The French simply did not want to concentrate their armour and they used them in penny packets all over the place, which in some ways had some benefit, but they needed at least one armoured reserve to be able to act decisively, and in that they lacked it. In the north, the 3rd Panzer Division was halted due to fierce resistance from the 3rd DLM. Bitter fighting resulted in the appearance of a large number of French tanks, panicked the German command into thinking a major counterattack was developing, when in fact they were just rearguard actions. Both sides suffered significant losses in armour, but as night fell, the 3rd DLM halted rearguard actions and the German command regained its composure. The Allied forces had gained themselves time to reorganise their forces to respond to another German assault on the 15th of May. But in summary, the Germans had failed to make the clean breakthrough that they had so desired. In terms of conclusion, the German Panzer II and IVs were the only German tanks that could match the S-35 medium tank in battle. The S-35 tank was generally considered to be one of the most formidable tanks during the campaign in the West. German tactics proved superior. By using radio to coordinate manoeuvres, the Germans outwitted the French, who were limited to rigid, static positions as in the First World War. The French tanks could not communicate with such fluidity or rapidity. The French missed tactical and operational opportunities and were poorly coordinated. The German tanks also had more crew members, so the commanders could concentrate on command tasks, but French commanders had to act as gunners and assistant gunners. Now, this quote comes directly from Wikipedia, and my own personal comment is that it's greatly exaggerated. It is actually true. The Germans looked at the S-35, and if it was such a great tank, why not use it for themselves? And they didn't, because they didn't particularly like the lack of 3 crew in the turret. But we discovered, based on looking at these accounts, that when the French had matched the Germans in terms of numbers, they gave as good as that they got. So in many ways, the real failure here was not specific down to individual tanks and communication, which obviously was a factor. The real point here to be made is the use. The Germans constantly used their armour at a regimental level, while the French rarely, basically stayed at a battalion level for most of the campaigns. They simply spread their armour all over the place. And when they did do some minimal concentrations, where they concentrated 3 squadrons together, they actually achieved great things. So I think the main problems here was purely doctrinal rather than, whether or not people, there was a two-man crew or a three-man crew, etc. So yes, elements of truth, but I think this was greatly exaggerated. The real problem was doctrine, which is a little bit harder to understand if you're not a military focused sort of person. My attempt to determine the course and details of this battle was based on a number of unrelated sources, such as Wiki and a host of organisational sources on the web and in books I possess. I may well have misunderstood the various comments and placed the battles and thrusts in the wrong position. However, I feel confident I have accurately reflected the general flow of the battle, but the detail is certainly open to further analysis. My next objective is to convert this into something which can be played using figures in a micro-armour environment. From the moment the Germans contacted the French on the 12th of May to the French retreat on the 14th of May, the Germans advanced 10 kilometres against opposition. This represents an advance of about 3 to 4 kilometres per day. At a scale of 1 in 10,000, this represents an advance of 100 centimetres. The width of the battlefield, where the fighting occurred, was 20 kilometres, or 200 centimetres of frontage, at a scale of 1 in 10,000. This conflict involved two divisions, which would normally require a playing area of 6 feet wide by 4 feet deep. This represents a very large game, but the battle was divided into two main thrusts, the 3rd Panzer and 4th Panzer, so a player would typically pick the flank they wish to play and use a more standard 3 foot by 4 foot playing area. This is an example of a meeting engagement, which is normally very rare. Because the Germans were able to advance 10 kilometres, they would have had a host of other advantages, such as morale and air power, to give them the required advantage in order to advance against what seemed like a reasonably equal force. On the other hand, it should be noted the Germans did concentrate their two panzer divisions against a single French DLM and managed to soak off the other French DLM with infantry, so perhaps the Germans did achieve a 2-to-1 advantage even with the air and morale support. The other issue is that this was over 3 days, so the advantage would be no more than a 150% advantage. So when we factor in what I've just described, the advance does align with most micro-armour rules and most playtesting I've conducted. This actually would make an interesting scenario. However, it would be a very long game. The Germans basically advanced 30 centimetres per day, or 6 game turns on a scale of 1 in 10,000 using a set of rules such as LWRS or Bewegunskrieg. This is not a fast and free-flowing game, but is one which offers some interesting options. I'll first look at refighting this using a squad scale set of rules, where one element represents a vehicle or squad. In this case, the force being commanded was a battalion. This shows the main locations of the various engagements. However, these engagements typically range up to a regiment in size, if not more. There are many encounters which could be refought. However, at this scale, it's very difficult to obtain accurate force mixes. You would be better off playing a typical points-based game with the force mixes allowed by the divisions on the battlefield in this period. Apart from this, there is little point in trying to refight this battle at squad scale, apart from using the historical force mixes, because quite frankly a squad scale set of rules normally spans no more than 1 or 2 hours, and nothing really meaningful could occur in that period that would be related to this battle. Using a platoon scale set of rules, where a player can command a regiment, each of these markers could represent a game. If we're using Spearhead, we could reproduce a 4-hour conflict with ease, and as most of the regiments involved are known, we could arrive at a reasonably accurate force mix. However, this will not be refighting any reasonable proportion of the entire battle. Even at 4 hours, this represents a small fraction of the entire battle. The Germans even attacked at night in one incident, so the whole battle could represent up to 40 hours of combat, with no activity during the night except for the single German night attack. This is a borderline possibility, and I suspect falling back on a points-based system using historical force mixes is the best option. But you could recreate one of the approximate 40 engagements that I have identified that occurred during this entire battle. If we use a company scale set of rules, each player could command a full division. In this case, we could refight either of the two flanks, or if using a pair of players per side, a single game with each player commanding a division. This represents a real viable option, with most likely set of rules being LWRS, Bivagunskri, Panzer Corps, or the company scale version of Corps Commander. You could also consider refighting this using BBB WW2, which may be the best option. There are about 18 battalions on the French side and 17 battalions on the German side, so this would be a very large game. But using a team of 2 players on each side, this is a viable scenario. As the entire battle spanned 3 days, it would be a long game, but you should be able to play 2 days at least if you had an entire day to play. If you wanted to recreate the entire battle, I would suggest that you would need 2 days in order to do so, and 2 players per side. If we use a battalion scale set of rules, each player could command both divisions, and in this case we could refight the entire battle with 2 players. There are very few battalion scale set of rules available. There is a battalion scale version of the Corps Commander, which would be the best option. Mega Blitz, KISS and Divisional Commander are also an option. However, these have a very board game feel to them, so they may not suit many gamers. D-Day to Berlin would be a very good fit, but the equipment details for 1940 would be required. Finally, there is a regimental scale version of Bloody Big Battles World War II, which would be another option. This is a beta set of rules, but as long as players could agree when issues arise, this is a very good option, maybe actually probably the best option to initially try. But in summary, I feel the Corps Commander, or the battalion scale version of Corps Commander, which is called 5.Corps Commandeur, is the best option. The regimental scale version of Bloody Big Battle World War II would be possibly the second best option and probably give you a much quicker game. And finally, D-Day to Berlin would be a good option if you can create the necessary equipment list, and may actually be the most complete and polished version. This is the only scale which would allow 2 players to game the entire battle within a real day. Final thing I wish to cover is the maps which we will be using to create the playing area. I downloaded this from the wiki site, and while some of the details concerning the formations are clearly wrong, the map is rather good and could be used to create a playing area. The width is about 20 kilometres, so if using LWRS, the playing area would need to be 6 or 7 feet wide by a similar depth. If using the battalion version of Corps Commander rules, which uses a scale of 1 in 30,000, the width is a maximum of 3 feet and a similar depth. The latter covers a much larger part of the battlefield. If you are using movement trays with the battalion scale version of Corps Commander, the scale drops to 1 in 10,000, which means we're back to a large playing area. Possibly the most viable option to convert this particular campaign into a figure gaming format that does include the entire campaign is to use a set of rules such as Neue Schwerpunkt. Neue Schwerpunkt is a set of figure gaming rules which is based on SBI's Modern Battles board game, and it uses a scale of 1 day per game turn and a ground scale of 1 to 60,000. Now, this has the advantage that you can actually cover the entire campaign with a set of rules like this. The only issue is that you would almost certainly have to recreate the entire Hannut and Jean Bleu campaign, not just the Hannut campaign and then play a separate game for the Jean Bleu campaign. When you combine these 2 operations, the combat began roughly on the 12th and ended on the 15th or 16th of June. If you started on the 11th, because there is a German coming on the playing area phase, and ended on the 16th, you end up with 6 game turns, which is short but not unreasonable. You could probably extend it out to the 18th and get a more reasonable 8 game turn game very easily. The playing area, which in Neue Schwerpunkt is a standard 3x4 foot playing area, would probably look something like this. Now, you would have to include the forces that were in the north and south of both of the mechanised and armoured divisions, with the German infantry division on either side of the German panzer divisions. You'd also need to probably have the Moroccan division arriving as reinforcements for the French. This would be a rather high unit density, possibly 48 elements on the German side and 60 elements on the Allied side. Now, one benefit of the SPI board game base Neu Schwerpunkt is that you can play around with scales very easily. So scaling up the foot infantry into regiment size units would reduce the element count on both sides. You could also use a big base solution, which also would allow you to accommodate a higher unit density. Of course, if you expand the scenario to include the entire front line in this area, then you would almost certainly have a situation where the French were not going to make the same mistakes they made historically. The two DLM divisions would almost certainly be cooperating much better than they did historically, and almost certainly the French would not scatter their tanks around into penny packets, which could easily be defeated by the numerically superior Germans. You'd also have the French conducting more combined arms operations. This is actually one of the big issues with the Allies, and when I tried to create scenarios for both the Western Front and the Desert Front and also the Eastern Front, the biggest issue I had was that the Allies generally did not conduct combined arms operations until well into the war. And this gave the Germans a massive advantage. And how do you reflect it in a set of rules? Anyway, in these set of rules you can actually reflect it to an extent. Now, of course, you could create special rules to ensure the French don't, unhistorically coordinate or cooperate, unhistorically, concentrate their armour, and unhistorically conduct combined operation. And that's certainly an option. But I tell you what, if you attempt to design the scenario, you quickly realise what the French issues actually were. And so we come to a close of my Part 1 military history series of videos. I'll leave it up to an enthusiastic gamer to actually create a scenario from this battle. I must admit it would be an interesting project, and I did actually investigate creating a scenario using the Neu Schwerpunkt rules, and I probably will complete it once I manage to assemble a French force, which I have purchased, I just haven't painted. Denken Sie daran, immer für Heil, Heimatland zu kämpfen.